country's third general election in less than 5 years. The poll comes at a critical time for the United Kingdom, a country whose position in the world is in flux and whose future is far from certain. By Friday morning, we should know which side will form Britain's next government. SABC correspondent in the UK, Holly Hudson, joins us now about voting day. Holly, so Brits have been confronted with two drastically different visions for what comes next and must decide between two very different men to lead them. What has been the response so far today?
Yes, two wildly different directions that the main political parties here want to take the country in. Voting is well underway here. The polls have been open since 7 a.m. It's now 4 a.m. UK time. So as you can see, it's wet, windy, dark. Will that affect voter turnout? This is, of course, the third election in 5 years and the first in winter in almost a century. So that is something to contend with, that the political parties will have to contend with. And this is perhaps the biggest decision that voters are set to make in a generation. It's being billed as a historic election because, of course, those two parties want to take the country in two very different directions. This could decide the political direction of the UK, its economy and its place in the world, not least, of course, what will happen with Brexit and indeed even if it will happen, as Boris Johnson, of course, called this election for the sole reason that he wants to get Brexit done. That is what we've heard much repeated throughout this campaign. He wants to put his oven-ready deal through Parliament by the current Brexit deadline of January 31st. So the Conservative Party are offering a route out of what they're calling a paralysis of this gridlock. That is what they want to achieve. The Labour Party, the other main opposition party, offering the hope of a second referendum to those Remain supporting voters here. So two very different directions. The polls at the moment, the latest polls, suggesting that Boris Johnson is on track to win that majority, but the Conservatives can in no way be complacent, not least because, of course, the polls here cannot be trusted in many ways. They have not been reliable in the past three electoral votes here, including the 2016 referendum result. Three very shocking, jaw-dropping results that we saw in all three of those votes here. What we do know, though, is that a hung parliament is still a possibility. That is, of course, when a party doesn't win over half of the seats in the House of Commons. So although Boris Johnson on track at the moment, a hung parliament still very much a possibility, so all to play for.
Very interesting that you should say that, Holly, because some of the pollsters are predicting that the Tories will come in at 44% of the share of the national vote and Labour at 33%. So is it possible, as you say, whether Boris Johnson is on course for the biggest Conservative majority since 1992?
Yes, some of the polls here do project that Boris Johnson could still win a thumping majority. However, they say their margin of error does still allow for a hung parliament. And the thumping majority that was predicted earlier on at the start of this campaign 5 weeks ago, Boris Johnson on track at that point, they claimed for a 68-seat majority. That has now halved to 28 in the latest poll that's considered to be the most accurate, that accurately predicted the hung parliament in the last election. And there's so many factors at play here that could tip the balance, could spell trouble for the Conservatives in terms of that majority, not least tactical voting. Now, that is where Remain supporting parties are encouraging people in very marginal seats that just rest on a few thousand votes to vote for a party they might not originally, in order to deprive Boris Johnson of that majority. Turnout as well. As we said, it's cold, it's wet, it's dark. Will people actually turn out in their numbers? We're expecting around 30 to 40 million. That's usually the turnout that we see here in the United Kingdom. But of course, this weather, this time of year, will that affect things? Aside from that as well, apathy. There's a lot of voters here still agonising over this decision. Many feel that they're just voting for the lesser of two evils. People on the doorstep calling this an unpopularity contest, because this is between the two main parties, of course, led by two very unpopular leaders, Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. As well as that, Have their messages stuck? Are they the right messages for those parties? Get Brexit done. Will that, of course, appease Tory Remainers? Where will they go? And for Labour, the fact that they've tried to frame this as anything but Brexit, will that stick with their ardent Leave-supporting voters?
So, Holly, speaking of tactical voting, reports are saying that Boris Johnson himself did not vote in his own constituencies, but rather chose Westminster and London. Is this a sign of how confident he is where his seat is?
Well, his seat is in Uxbridge on the outskirts of London, and there have actually been several campaigns there too in terms of tactical voting. Even one campaign in particular, a very small one called Votey McVoteface. Now that is based on a sort of loophole really in electoral laws whereby Remain supporters, Labour supporters, Liberal Democrat supporters are calling on people of no fixed abode. So people who actually either reside on a boat that have moored up in Uxbridge to actually vote in that constituency. They claim they've been calling on them to try and deprive Boris Johnson of that seat. So that is in no way guaranteed either, and they may well obviously not take too kindly to the fact that he's voted in Westminster too. But Boris Johnson has been targeting those Labour strongholds, the Red Wall as it's known, across Wales and across the North and the Midlands, that are Labour strongholds that did vote for Leave in the referendum. So will that fall? That will be crucial to whether Boris Johnson gains back those seats that the Conservatives lost in 2017, and that could be what this election rests on, whether the Conservatives can pull those seats back. If it does end up in a hung parliament, that will be a huge humiliation for Boris Johnson and could spell trouble for him as well as the Conservative Party. And we could well be back here in a few months' time with another election and another Prime Minister if that is the case.
Holly, thank you very much. And of course, later on, we will speak about those other issues that are possibly going to sway the vote. Social care, health care, taxes, and of course, we'll also talk about climate change. UK correspondent Holly Hudson.